Hey guys, and welcome to a bonus episode of Reward Offered. For those who aren't aware, just over a week ago marked 50 years since the murders of Lorraine Wilson and Wendy Evans, the case also known as the Murphy's Creek murders. The girls were found on the outskirts of a city called Toowoomba, and this case is still infamous amongst the locals today. 50 years unsolved is an incredibly rare milestone for any case to reach, particularly in Australia. In the lead up to the 6th of October anniversary, I spoke with Michael Nolan, a journalist with Toowoomba's local paper, The Chronicle. Firstly, a big thank you to Mike for speaking with me about the girl's story and for being willing to hear and consider my concerns I shared with him regarding the investigation of the case to date. For this bonus episode, I've extracted the audio from a video I uploaded to the Justice for Lorraine Wilson and Wendy Evans Facebook page. In that video and this episode, we discuss the contents of Mike's article. There are some crucial visuals that you obviously won't have listening to this podcast, so be sure to watch the video afterwards to see those. I want to be clear. I am in no way attacking Mike. I do not expect any journalist to contradict a 50-year-old narrative, particularly with what's public at this point in time. And given how much misinformation has been bounded about in this case, I don't fault him for any errors. I do believe he had nothing but the best of intentions with his presentation of the case based on the information he had at his disposal, and that which was presented to him by other contributors. With regard to the article, to try and keep things more concise, I chose to focus on the important points I thought needed to be touched on up front. Everything else will be covered in the upcoming season of Unravelling Murphy's Creek, so subscribe to that podcast if you haven't already. As mentioned in the video, anyone from Toowoomba might have noticed that this is the first article that has been published in the city over the last 5 decades that has given any airtime to any concerns about the investigation into the girls' murders. I cannot overstate how crucial of a step that is for us. Finding answers in this case does not require millions of readers or listeners, but it does require the right ones. And it's the eyes and ears of the Toowoomba locals that we need to hit. One thing I believe police and the media have gotten correct to date is that those with information in this case are afraid to speak up about certain individuals. But the cracks in the narrative are starting to show. And my hope is that with enough of us working together to question what has really happened in this case, that those cracks will open up. And those with information will finally feel comfortable enough to come forward with what they know. So if you have friends or family who were in Toowoomba in the 1970s, at any point since then, or who are living there currently, please head to Lorraine and Wendy's Facebook page or use the link in the description and send them the video. If they aren't on social media, save the video and play it for them the next time you see them. Discuss this case. I guarantee you that the answers to what happened to these 2 innocent girls has been hiding in plain sight in the rumours whispered amongst particular segments of the Toowoomba community for decades. And I promise you the puzzle is taking shape. But it's the people of Toowoomba who have the missing pieces we require to ensure Lorraine and Wendy and their families receive the justice and answers they deserve. I'm your host Amanda. Let's get into the article. If any of the details of this case cause you distress, please reach out to Lifeline on 13 11 14 in Australia or a relevant crisis support service in your local area. We are talking about the Chronicle article that came out yesterday, by the time you're watching this. Came out on the 7th of October, 2024. First of all, anything in this video is my opinion and my opinion alone. I do not speak on behalf of any other individual. Secondly, I wanted to say thank you again to Mike for speaking with me, for including my concerns in the article. For anyone who's from Toowoomba, you might have noticed that, as far as I know, this is the first article that the Chronicle has ever printed in the case that has included any critiques of the police investigation or the coronial inquest. As I keep telling people, one of the main things that we need to do is correct this narrative. So anything that I say in this is not me attacking Mike. There is very little sensationalism in this, which I'm very happy about. As I said last night, it's really difficult to be thorough and quick, but I will try and be as concise as possible. So we've got a bit to get through, so let's get started. Now, I'm not gonna include the front page. It's basically just a summary of the whole article. I'm not mentioned on the front page. No hard feelings, Mike. So we're just going to start at page 4. It has been 50 years since 2 nurses, Lorraine Wilson and Wendy Evans, were murdered at the bottom of the Toowoomba Range. And despite 2 coronial inquests, the answer to who did it lies with a mysterious woman who has never been identified. Okay, so this is obviously Ellen from Kim Sandercock's story. If Ellen is a real person, then yes, she could very well have answers to this case. But she is certainly not the only place that answers will come from. There's plenty of other avenues to find out what happened here. With their first year of nursing finished, Wendy Evans and Lorraine Wilson were in search of adventure. The Sydney-based pair set Brisbane in their sights and took off in Lorraine's Volkswagen Beetle in the spring of 1974. Wendy and Lorraine made it to Goondiwindi before car troubles interrupted their fun. But Wendy and Lorraine weren't easily deterred. They hitchhiked to Queensland's capital, where they spent the week enjoying life. It was their return trip home that would tragically change the course of both of their lives. Wendy and Lorraine, still waiting for the Beetle to be repaired, made the fateful decision to continue hitchhiking. They left Wendy's sister's home in Camp Hill at 11 a.m. on October 6, 1974, bound for Dubbo. It would be the last their loved ones saw them alive. In the days that followed, Lorraine was killed by what is believed to be sharp blows to her head. Wendy was savagely bashed and her skull rendered to a pulp. Their bodies were discovered by chance in June 1976 at a clearing on the outskirts of Toowoomba. Wendy and Lorraine were fully clothed and their legs were bound in a manner used by pig hunters to hobble their prey. First point of contention. I do not believe the girls were fully clothed. For 2 reasons. 1. No photo has ever been shown showing clothing over a bone. Secondly, this is an article from Sunday, June 27, 1976, and I will flip the camera so that you can see it. I forgot to mention that it's a Sydney Morning Herald article. Okay, so ignore all my other highlighting, but there's the date in the top left corner there, and here's the paragraph we're interested in. So 2 days after the girls are found, police said clothing found at the scene had not been on the skeletons. I don't think the girls were clothed. The point about their legs being bound in a manner used by pig hunters to hobble their prey, I don't know where this comes from. There are certainly knots in one of the 2 ropes that could indicate that. Possibly knots in both that could indicate that. One rope is not on the bodies. You probably will have seen that photo. I'll find it. I'll show you. Now, in the podcast, I'll address a few issues that I have with the ropes. But do you see the problem with this photo? This is not a photo of this rope in situ. That's evidenced by the fact that the ground underneath it has been raked to the side. So this rope was moved, the ground was raked, and the rope has been replaced. So I don't know how the rope was initially. It might have looked kind of similar to this, but it may not have. So this is not a photo of this rope in situ. In any case, the rope in that photo, there's no evidence of how that rope was utilised. It could have been used in that manner, but I don't think that there's any way to know for sure. Moving on. The hunt for their killers began immediately. Multiple witnesses reported seeing 2 men and 2 women arguing beside a light green Holden sedan on the downhill section of the Toowoomba Range just hours after they were seen in Brisbane. I've raised my issues with the range sightings before, and I will no doubt raise them again in the podcast, in Unravelling Murphy's Creek. I've done a spreadsheet on the range sightings. Look, Two of the sightings somewhat align. They could be talking about the same event. That's the Britches and Robert Styler, and we'll come back to them in a second. The rest of them, completely different. There's no way that you could look at all of these and say they're the same thing. Time of day varies. Whether they even ID Lorraine and Wendy. 4 of the 6 sightings don't even ID Lorraine and Wendy. The number of people, the number of men, the number of women. One of them has 6 men and 2 females there. Number of cars, colours of cars, makes of cars. One of them has a black Falcon. The descriptions of the men at the scene, completely different across all of them. They're not the same event. Now, as I said, the only 2 that are even remotely close to being the same are the Britches and Robert Styler, and both of them have issues. The coroner himself questions Robert Styler's ability to be able to ID Wayne Hilton at that time. The Britches, the cops themselves say that they ruled them out, that they ruled out that sighting as having been on the 6th of October. The Britches said that their daughter was in hospital. Police reckon they checked the hospital records and that they ruled it out that it could have been on the 6th. So the police are saying that one's ruled out. And yet we seem to be picking and choosing when we want to use information from one of these sightings. We'll come back to them in the podcast. Just one more note. For example, there's no way that you're confusing whether your event happens at 2 to 3 p.m. in the afternoon, as the Beatles say that theirs does, and the Britches and Robert Styler when theirs happens at roughly 9 p.m. at night. They're not the same event. These women were not standing on the side of that range for 7 hours in distress. I refuse to believe that. That didn't happen. It didn't happen. It just didn't happen. Varying reports indicated a woman was pulled towards the car, while others say they heard women calling for help. Several of the witnesses said the women matched the description of Wendy and Lorraine. But in the 50 years since their deaths, justice was never delivered to the people who savagely murdered these 2 women. The one that got away. Retired Detective Paul Rouge believes that if Wayne Boogie Hilton was alive today, police would have enough evidence to charge him with the double murder along with accomplice Alan Shorty Laurie. He's entitled to that opinion. I would love to speak to any prosecutor or even barrister who would believe that would happen if they were alive. I'd be interested in talking to those people. The 2 men were part of a network of criminals who had run afoul of police but were not considered murder suspects until the late 80s. The 2 men being a part of a network of criminals, I don't know what that is based on. Mike, if you want to tell me what that's based on, I'd be very interested to know. If it's a comment from Rouge, fair enough. If that's your own writing there, I'd be very interested to know what it's based on. Were not considered murder suspects until the late 80s. Mr. Rouge was handed the cold case in 1987 after police received a tip-off from a prison informant who recalled hearing 2 other inmates brag about killing the women. He interviewed the 3 inmates but said their story did not stack up. They were basically big-noting themselves, Mr. Rouge said. From these interviews, Mr. Rouge was led to other members of the families, namely best mates Wayne Hilton and Alan Laurie. I don't know where that statement comes from. If anyone out there can find anyone who says that Wayne Hilton and Alan Laurie were best mates, please rewardofferedpod@gmail.com. Please do contact me. Quote, there were a number of things that made them the prime suspects, unquote, Mr. Rouge said. They included an eyewitness who put the men with Wendy and Lorraine at a shop on Ipswich Road close to when they disappeared, along with other witnesses who believed they saw the men arguing with the women on the downhill section of the Toowoomba Range. Again, we'll come back to the range sightings more in depth in the podcast. Let's talk about Anthony Doherty. So we have no way of verifying that it is Lorraine and Wendy that Anthony Doherty sees in his reported event. Let's just say for a second that it is. We're going to borrow a little clip from the 60 Minutes segment for a second. Okay, full credit to 60 Minutes.
Late that morning, a car pulls.
Note this guy's appearance. Note the colour of his hair.
I've started thinking a lot more frequently about my own mortality. So I created When We Die Talks, a social media project turned podcast where I ask people to share what they believe happens when we die. I like to think of it as if I'm crowdsourcing ideas about death, not just to find something I can believe in, but to explore ways we can all become more comfortable with the unknown. This podcast is more than just conversations about death. It's about learning how to live without being paralyzed by the fear of the inevitable.
A distinctive green and white EJ or EH Holden noticed by witnesses. And the two girls are offered a ride as far as Toowoomba. The men in the car...
He's about to say are almost certainly Wayne Boogie Hilton and Alan Shorty Laurie. Now remember the driver of the vehicle. Does he look like either of them? Look at how dark their hair is. Now let's look at Doherty's statement. Okay, so first person Doherty talks of. He described the person in the car as about 20 years of age with a very scruffy appearance. He had a round face with black, curly, matted hair. And when he looked at Mr. Doherty, he had a silly grin on his face. The second one, he described the driver of the car as about 20 years of age with a sun-tanned appearance and looked like the surfer type of that era. He said the driver was about 180 centimetres, medium build with a thin face. He had sandy brown, medium-length, straight hair. Which one is that? Please tell me which one of them fits that description. You see my problem? You see my problem with that statement? That it's almost certainly Wayne and Shorty? Neither of them match that description. If you say it's... The other description is just vague enough to be either of them. It could have been my dad. Like, it... I could match anyone back there. Mr. Rouge said Alan Laurie's birthday was around October 6th and the men had travelled to Brisbane so he could get a tattoo to mark the occasion. So it was possible they could have picked the women up near the city. Alan Laurie's birthday was October 6th. I have no idea where the tattoo story originated. I don't know which witness that is. I have yet to come across the origin of that tattoo story. So I will have to get back to you at a later point about that. A third witness claimed the rope used to hog-tie the women was the type used at the KR Bacon factory where Alan Laurie worked. Okay. There was 3 Alan Lauries. Okay. There is Alan Shorty Laurie, who is a person of interest in this case. There is Alan Ungie Laurie, who is a person of interest in this case. There is a third Alan Laurie, who is not a person of interest in this case, but who was also known as Shorty. This gentleman, don't stop moving you, this gentleman, the third Alan Laurie, worked at the bacon factory. The employment records for the Alan Laurie that worked at KR Bacon Factory do not match Alan Shorty Laurie, who is a person of interest in this case. They do match the birth details, or at least birth year, of the third Alan Laurie. I believe it is him that worked at the bacon factory, not the Alan Laurie, or either Alan Laurie, that was a person of interest in this case. Now, this could indicate one of two things. Either Queensland Police was unaware that there was a third Alan Laurie and didn't even know who the evidence matched and just disregarded the fact that the birth year for the Alan Laurie didn't match either of the persons of interest in the case. Or it's a possibility that they did know that it didn't match either of them and that there was a third Alan Laurie and that it did in fact indicate him. But they chose to use it because it was useful, because it could point to one of their suspects. I don't know which it is. I don't know if they just were uninformed, didn't know about the third Alan Laurie, or whether they actively used it knowingly. It's getting late. I'm starting to ramble. I'm going to continue this tomorrow. Okay, we are back. We are caffeinated. let's finish this article. And I wanted to be clear, I'm not implicating this third Alan Laurie in this. It's just his name's been roped into this. That's it. While a fourth witness said she saw Wayne Hilton removing carpet from the back of a light green Holden sedan and burning it around the time of the murder. I will go into Edith O'Neill's statement in the podcast. To try and keep this as short as possible, I'm just going to say it's an incredibly vague statement that occurred, quote, towards the end of 1974. Make of it what you will for the moment. Quote, putting all those little things together painted a picture that Wayne Hilton and Laurie were involved, end quote, Mr. Rouge said. Unfortunately, his suspicions could never be tested by a jury. Wayne Hilton died in a motorbike crash in June 1986 while Alan Laurie went silent. First of all, Wayne Hilton did not die in a motorbike crash. He was driving a vehicle. He did collide with a motorbike, but in any case, he was not on a motorbike. Quote, there were a number of things that made Alan Laurie a prime suspect, but he claimed legal privilege, end quote, Mr. Rouge said. Quote, we took him into the police station, and as soon as we told him we wanted to talk about the murders, he went ballistic. He bellowed like a bull, and we did not get any further than that. That was strange for him. He had only had minor involvement with traffic offences, and such a reaction was indicative that he had some involvement. This line at the end, such a reaction was indicative that he had some involvement. Look, I cannot speak to the anecdotal experience of a detective, but in terms of psychological literature, that statement is categorically false. Innocent people do not just sit there quietly while they're accused. Innocent people get angry. Now, yes, there is outliers, but majority of the time, innocent people get angry. We'll go into that whole thing further in the podcast, but just as a quick example, you can do your own research on this. This was a study in 2021, I believe, done by Harvard Business School and the University of Toronto. So I'll put a link to this in the comments below, but the study is titled Anger Damns the Innocent. It was a collection of 6 studies that they did to determine how people react to being falsely accused and how those reactions affect others' perceptions of their guilt or innocence. A couple of key points I want to touch on here. Those who were falsely accused reported feeling angrier and to claim that they were being unfairly assessed. Every time, participants judged those who reacted angrily as being guiltier than those who reacted with calm. The only people who seemed guiltier to these subjects were those who pleaded the fifth in court and refused to say anything at all. Those doing the study then performed a similar experiment on 136 professionals whose job ought to give them some sort of insight into guilt and innocence: law enforcement professionals, fraud investigators, lawyers, and similar professions. Even they thought that those who reacted with anger and those who refused to answer questions at all were likely to be guilty. They thought those who reacted calmly were most likely to be innocent. It's a sad state of affairs when even trained professionals think reacting calmly to an accusation makes you innocent and reacting angrily makes you guilty, when the opposite is likely to be true. So researchers from the study said, quote, we find that anger is an invalid cue of guilt and is instead a valid cue of innocence. Most people, even professionals whose job require them to pass the guilty from the innocent, use emotional cues to determine whether someone is guilty. More often than not, following these emotional cues will lead you to the wrong conclusion. This tallies with existing literature, which suggests that most people are really bad at knowing whether someone is lying or telling the truth. I certainly hope that this interaction is not the genesis of Mr. Rouge's belief in Shorty Laurie's guilt in this case, because if it is, that is a very rocky foundation. And this is unfortunately a perfect example of cognitive bias. Okay, let's continue. Police could not build a sufficient case to charge Alan Laurie before he died from a heart attack in the early 90s. I don't know where that time frame comes from. Alan Laurie died in December of 2000. He certainly did not die in the early 90s. In the years that followed, Mr. Rouge said that the case against the men had strengthened, in particular by several women who came forward around the time of the second coronial inquest in 2013. The inquest heard material from 3 women who alleged they were abducted off the streets in Toowoomba by men fitting their descriptions and raped. This I'm going to leave for now. This will take way too long to break down now, but we will go into that in the podcast. He is haunted by the case. Quote, I still think regularly about the fate of the two women and what has happened since then, end quote, Mr. Rouge said. All right, now I got to hear from some broad. Okay, questions remain. While the coroner has ruled that Wayne Hilton was responsible for murders, I think he means for the murders, not everyone is convinced. True crime podcaster Amanda Doyle has spent the past 3 years combing through material from the 3 investigations and believes the matter is far from solved. Goddamn right I do. She said there was information provided to police that the nurses were intending to stay with a family at Murphy's Creek who came to know Lorraine through connections in Dubbo. That is correct. I would like to make it very clear. This connection to Murphy's Creek is not through a Hilton or Laurie. Quote, there was no mention of this family during the inquest, end quote, Miss Doyle said. Quote, I would have thought interviewing them would be crucial for establishing a timeline. Amanda is right. There were also discrepancies in the accounts given to police from the witnesses who saw 2 men and 2 women arguing on the downhill section of the Toowoomba Range Road. That's the sightings we spoke of that we'll go into in the podcast. Quote, there were also other people who came forward but were not mentioned in the 2013 inquest, including 2 men who called Crime Stoppers in 1997 and said they were with Lorraine and Wendy in Toowoomba. And to be clear, neither of these men are a Hilton or a Laurie, nor are they any of the other persons of interest in this case. I don't even think you have to be a casual consumer of true crime to understand why speaking to these 2 gentlemen might be incredibly useful to your timeline. Because what does our timeline look like at the moment? We have Lorraine and Wendy leave Camp Hill at roughly 11 a.m., October 6, 1974. Their bodies are found June 25th, 1976. We have no confirmed point on that timeline between then. These 2 gentlemen can give us at least 2. When and where they picked them up from, and when and where they dropped them off. Who were they with when you dropped them off? What were they wearing? Where did you drop them off? These are all crucial questions that have never been answered, and in 50 years have never been asked. Why did Queensland Police, including Mr. Rouge, despite knowing this information, fail to investigate these crucial elements of Lorraine and Wendy's movements? Quote, they inserted themselves into the investigation but have never been questioned by police, end quote, she said. What information they have would be crucial for the timeline. I would argue that there isn't a single thing that is more crucial to the timeline than what these 2 gentlemen have to say. Quickly, while we're on the topic of these 2 men, I just want to circle back around to the rope for a second. We're told that it comes from the KR Bacon factory, which is kind of weird because police at one point said that they'd excluded that it came from the bacon factory. But let's just say for a second that it does. The implication is that it's associated with meatworks, right? Now, I'm not saying that this is indicative of anything, just simply that it would be curious that of these 2 men that admit to being with Lorraine and Wendy in Toowoomba, that one of them on a 1977 electoral roll would list himself as having been employed as a butcher. She is highly critical of the inquest. I'm not going to get into that now. I will deal with that on the podcast. Quote, my worry is that there are people out there who have information but won't come forward because they have this narrative in their mind, end quote, Ms. Doyle said. Quote, people with relevant information can't come forward if they are working with incorrect information, end quote. I do believe that there is people out there in Toowoomba who have information as to other persons being involved in this crime. That does not mean if you have information relevant to the 7 persons of interest, I don't want to hear from you. I want to hear from anyone who has any information about this crime. I don't have a dog in this fight. I'm interested in following the evidence wherever it leads. I'm certainly not going to pursue evidence because it does or doesn't point to one particular individual or several individuals. One woman knows the truth. Perhaps one of the most bizarre witness statements came from Kim Sandercock. 10 years after the brutal murders, she told Mr. Rouge that she was approached by a drunk woman at the Crown Hotel who went into painful detail about the grisly event. The woman is only known as Ellen. The 2013 inquest heard Ellen told Miss Sandercock that she was with, quote, Shorty and one of the Hilton boys when they killed the nurses, end quote. In Miss Sandercock's statement to police, she said Ellen said she was with the two men when they picked up the nurses with the intention of raping them in some scrub at Murphy's Creek. She said one of the girls was in the front passenger seat and arguing with the driver when the second man hit her in the back of the head with a metal bar, causing her to fall forward and die. Ellen is alleged to have said that the second woman started screaming and was gagged while the group drove to the clearing at Murphy's Creek. When they arrived, it is alleged the second woman tried to flee but did not get far as her legs were tied. So I'm not sure where this notion that the second woman's legs were tied comes from. It's not a direct quote from Mr. Rouge, so it might be something incorrectly printed by someone prior that, in his defence, Mike wouldn't have any reason to know was incorrect. But Kim Sandercock does not mention either woman being tied up in her alleged story. She doesn't mention any rope or anyone being restrained in any way with any kind of ligature. Ellen went on to say that one of the men bashed the second nurse's head to a pulp and pulled out chunks of hair. This is the only account on record that marries with injuries the nurses suffered. Lorraine suffered a sharp blow to the back of her head, while Wendy's skull was shattered into dozens of pieces. Mr. Rouge said this information about the injuries was not publicly known when Miss Sandercock made her initial police statement. Correct. I haven't been able to find the specifics of an injury to the back of Lorraine's head, whereas Wendy's injuries seem to be more so to the entirety of her head. I have not seen those specifics in a newspaper article prior to Sandercock's statement in 1989. There certainly was information out there that their injuries were suffered to their heads. I will agree with that for the moment. When I took her statement, it was like she was in a trance, going back on what she remembered, he said. One thing that I will say now about this statement in the Chronicle is my concerns about where Sandercock gets this information. If we're saying that we're exclusively using the description of these injuries to prove validity to her statement, it's very important to note that yesterday morning, when this article came out, I called a witness that I've spoken to who gave police a statement regarding this case around the same time, and they confirmed, once again on the record, that when police came to them to take their statement, they showed them photos of the girls' skulls. As far as I'm concerned, that taints this statement. You can't use the information she gives if you're Now, I'm not saying that happened with Sandercock, but if it did happen with another witness, why would I assume that it wouldn't have happened with Kim Sandercock? That concerns me. That causes me to question several things about Kim Sandercock's statement. Quote, "It was unusual that a person quite a few years later would remember in that level of detail what that woman told her. It seemed to be more that she was the person who was reliving what she saw. It was eerie." End quote. Now, I completely agree that the level of detail in Kim Sandercock's story is strange, especially given she claims that this conversation happened 5 years prior to her statement, and that she's actively trying to not hear it as this woman is telling her because of how graphic it is. I agree, that's very strange, which only further makes me question this story about Ellen. Now, this notion that Kim Sandercock is getting this information from recalling a first-hand experience, yes, given the level of detail, that would make sense. And while I haven't been able to confirm it, I'm pretty sure that at the time of the murders, Kim Sandercock was in her very early teens. And we would have to presume that the age of any alleged perpetrators is going to be at least late teens to early 20s minimum. So I don't know why she would be hanging out with people that age. Again, there's the question of why she knew that these men were going to take these women to be raped. That part just doesn't make any sense to me. And on a table of options as to how she comes to this information, her being a first-hand witness to this is not high on my personal list of explanations. Of the 9 witnesses who came forward to report the altercation on the Toowoomba Range, none mentioned a third woman, though one mentioned a third man. Good pickup, Mike. I wouldn't have thought to include that. Quote, "I think her account fits the description of what actually happened," end quote, Mr. Rouge said. I agree. I agree that, given the physical evidence, Kim Sandercock's statement does match it. I just question where she's getting that information from. When it came time for the 2013 inquest, Ms. Sandercock declined to contribute in a meaningful way, saying she was on a course of medication that affected her memory. Now, I can't prove that that's not true. As far as I'm aware, no doctor was called to give evidence as to what she was on and how that would have been actually affecting her memory. No, I don't believe any evidence was provided to support this claim. One thing that is interesting, she claims that this conversation happens in the Crown in 1984. She gives her statement in 1989 and then is called to Lorraine and Wendy's inquest in 2013, claiming she has absolutely no memory. Yet, 5 years later, in 2018, this same woman, Miss Sandercock, is called to another coronial inquest, that of Annette Mason, regarding events that took place in 1989 in Annette Mason's murder. And in 2018, that coronial inquest has absolutely no issue recalling any of her information in that case. Now, one possible explanation for her not wanting to talk about evidence in Lorraine and Wendy's case in 2013 that was offered by the coroner was that she was in fear of retribution. From who? If it's Wayne and Shorty that are at this event, they're both dead. So there's going to be no retribution from them. The case remains unsolved with a $250,000 reward in place. That's it for this bonus episode of Reward Offered. If you're from Toowoomba, please share the video on the article so we can keep correcting this narrative. I will do this one person at a time if I have to, but I could really use your help. I'd like to encourage anyone with any information about the murders of Lorraine and Wendy to please share what you know. rewardofferedpod@gmail.com. You can remain entirely anonymous. Don't forget to subscribe to Unraveling Murphy's Creek if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys real soon. Thanks for listening. All right, that's gonna do it.